Now, if I had to introduce myself, I would say that I'm a literature professor, a specialist in late medieval and early modern Greek studies, literature, and the way I define it, it's a long period from the 12th to the 18th century, and I also have a keen interest in theory of literature and interdisciplinary approaches. So in this respect, I will present today the results of an educational experiment I conducted with my undergraduate students at the University of Cyprus in an attempt to demonstrate that comics can be the optimal way of achieving learning objectives, of developing or enhancing linguistic, visual, digital, and media literacy, while also allowing space for the expression of students' creativity. My paper will not be about reading comics in the classroom, but rather about producing them with the use of technology, and it is mainly addressed to educators, and I do hope that there are some educators among us today who will find some use in it. Now, in the winter semester of 2011, I offered a course on early modern Greek literature. The course aimed at familiarizing students with the early modern Greek literary production of the island of Crete. I'm sure it's all Greek to you, but some of you hopefully can read Greek. So it aimed at familiarizing students with the literary production of the island of Crete from the 14th to the 16th century. The syllabus included texts written in an older and often dialectal form of modern Greek, which is not very easily comprehensible by students nowadays. I will not produce a complete list of these texts here, but let me state that many of them are particularly important for modern Greek literary history, as they include, for example, the text that introduced rhyming verses in Greek literature in the 14th century, or the first modern Greek literary book that found its way to the printing houses in Venice in 1509, that is Apokopos. Many of these texts display Renaissance features or involve what Bakhtin would call, you can see a list of the text actually, if you can see it here, by author, it's Sachlikis, De La Porta, Sfalieros, etc. So many of these texts display Renaissance features or involve what Bakhtin would call grotesque realism, and are very humorous and quite enjoyable, provided of course that one is familiar with the socio-historical conditions in which they were produced and overcomes the obstacle of the language. What you have been seeing on the screen is the home page of the course's wiki, and I must say that I prefer open source wikis to expensive educational platforms like Blackboard, and I have been using them for my courses successfully since 2008. Now, in an effort to engage students actively in the early modern Greek, Cretan literature course, I decided to use creative tools and programs, and more specifically a software developed by an EU-funded research project called Comic Lab. The actual URL where you can find this program is webcomicbookcreator.com. You have it in your abstract in the list of sources. It's the last one. Because that was the name of the Comic Lab beta version, and the name of the project, of the European project, is this one. It's Edu Comics Project. I found about its existence in April 2010 when I attended a workshop at the Athens 2010 comicdom.com, organized by the project's coordinator, Professor Simos Retalis of the University of Piraeus. Now, I must say there are several tools freely available on the internet, tools that you can use to create your own comic strips, but also your own comic book. I have provided the list in the abstract as well. Some of them, this is a comprehensive but by no means exhaustive list. They include makebeliefscomics.com, which allows you to create your comic strip from a diverse cast of characters, scenes, and objects, or the strip generator, which offers the same but comes with a less rich library, or marvelkids.marvel.com activities, this one, where in the activities section you can create your own comic strip or comic book, but only with Marvel characters. Other tools include the popular Facebook application Bitstrips, which allows you to design cartoon avatars of your friends and make them appear as characters in your own comic. Toon-Do, which allows you to create your own comic strip or comic strip book from a library of characters, but also offers the possibility to create and color your own characters. And finally, the two most advanced programs, Pixton and Comic Lab. Pixton allows a lot of customization of characters without the need to build everything from scratch. But many of its features do not come for free. For example, in the free version, users can edit the look and appearance of a character, but not its proportions. And as critics have observed, I quote, "The limitations of the free Pixton program are frustrating. Even simple tasks such as making a comic private or public, or providing your comic with a description under the title, are only available for paying customers." End of quote. Similar is the case, unfortunately, with Comic Lab, which in fact withdrew from the web its free version 2 years ago, and only allows you to download the free trial version. But the advantages of Comic Lab over Pixton are that Comic Lab as an EU project offers better support of some less spoken European languages. It also offers some extra features like the Flip to Moodle platform, which allows you to publish your comic with active hypertext links in the Moodle platform, or the fact that it allows you to add hyperlinks, sounds and videos into text balloons. Plus, it comes at a much lower price for individuals, most probably because it is subsidized by the EU. So a single license for a year costs $45 US, whereas the same license for Pixton costs £169 a year. But both programs have special packages for student groups, and you may find that in some cases Pixton costs less than Comic Lab for multiple student licenses. Nonetheless, I work with Comic Lab for the main reason that it offered excellent support in Greek, and I'm not talking only about Greek fonts, which was important of course, but also about instructions in Greek, which were essential for some of my students. Unfortunately, no program comes in Russian, I've checked. In order to use the software effectively, so this is the Comic Lab, I'll leave it here. In order to use the software effectively, about a third of the lectures of my course had to be held in the university's computer labs, something that was clearly stated beforehand in the course summary. And as the course was addressed to humanities students, I must note that the idea that they would be obliged to work in a computer lab with a known to them software did put many of them off. Nonetheless, 44 brave students decided to attend the course in the end, and they did not regret it. In fact, they enjoyed it enormously. The central idea was that instead of taking a midterm exam, the students would attempt to create comics based on some of the texts of the syllabus. The choice was theirs, and the texts they chose were the following. First of all, The Parliament of Whores by Stefanos Sachlikis, a text written in the 1370s about the whores of Candia, Crete, and Sachlikis' personal involvement with one of them, the infamous Koutaiotena, who was supposedly responsible for his imprisonment. This is from an old Venetian manuscript depicting a whore. The title missing here is Putana, actually. The second text was the 15th century lamenting rhyme of Ioannis Pikatoros, a katabasis, or descent to the underworld, which displays a return to medieval ethics with lots of Christian moralizing and many Gothic or horror elements in the description of Hades. The third text was Apokopos by Bergadis, the first modern Greek literary printed book published in Venice in 1509. This is from the original a woodcut from the original publication, which is another catabasis, but unlike the Lamenting Crime, does not include any horror elements. On the contrary, it uses the setting of the underworld in a subversive manner in order to emphasize allegorical love and the joys of life. Finally, the fourth text was the late 15th, early 16th anonymous rhyme of the Maid and the Lad, another interesting text which introduces very modern ideas about love, sex, and marriage, which are unfortunately undermined by the story's tragic end, where the lad, unable to get willingly from the maid what he wanted, one night sneaks into her room and rapes her. Now, I have shown you the original covers my students chose for their comic books. This last one is not, it didn't have a cover, so what you see is the first page of the comic. And as you may have noticed, all texts they chose were written in verses, and in fact in rhyming verses. Now, when I repeated the experiment with another group of 55 students in 2011-2012, I offered them prose texts to choose from, and they came up with comic adaptations of the following: a 15th century version of the Porykologos, or plant expert, a fable pretty much like Aesop's animal fables, with a major difference that you get talking plants instead of talking animals. The Porykologos is also a parody of a Byzantine court trial, and instead of a morale in the end, it provides an etiological myth on why grapes produced wine, with all the negative effects that wine drinking causes to people. And it's a very interesting text, a very short one as well. The second text they chose was an episode from the 15th century Cypriot Chronicle of Leontios Macheras, the εξήγησης της Γλυκίας χώρας Κύπρου, again with no original cover. A prose narration of the eruption of the Santorini volcano in 1650 from a sermon. The episode of the encounter of Alexander the Great and the Amazons from the chapbook of Alexander of 1750. And finally, an allegorical text of the early 19th century, the Oniron, or Dream by Athanasios Psalidas, with references to the Greek language question. Now, I cannot possibly show you all the comic books in detail, but I have uploaded them on issue.com for those interested. So if you email me, I have included the email stasos.kaplanis@gmail.com. Now, nor can I provide a detailed account of how all students in both courses worked. Just let me say very briefly that for the production of the comics, each class had to be divided into groups, and that within each group, members were allocated specific roles. I will take the early modern Cretan course as an example. So a class of 44 was divided into 4 groups of 11 students, and within each group of 11 there were 3 writers responsible with the adaptation of the original text, 3 designers who had to locate or produce and process the images to be used for the visualization of the text, 3 editors responsible for setting up the pages, and 2 coordinators charged with the supervision of the whole project. One of them was also the group's representative in constant collaboration with me in order to solve any problems that occurred. All groups had at their disposal approximately a month for the production of their comic, which had to be of at least 8 pages. The number of pages could vary depending on the length of the literary text they had to adapt and on the difficulties they would encounter during the production, and believe me, they encountered many. Now, meeting the deadline and producing a minimum of 8 pages were the only restrictions imposed on groups. They could adapt the script in any way they wanted. They could use any pictures they wanted. They could arrange them in any manner they wanted, as long as they would provide a coherent narrative. Remember that we are talking about humanities students who had nothing to do with graphic design and none of whom was an artist. And therefore, the most difficult part of the project seemed to be the design aesthetic part. But people can be very creative and innovative if you let them, and I must admit that I was pleasantly surprised by the variety of solutions my students provided and by the different paths they followed. Thus, the Apokopos team decided to stay very close to the original text. So you see, they reproduced the original text in capitals, as in is the custom in comics. Εφανιστή μου κι έτρεχα εις λιβάδιν ωραιωμένων, φαρίνε καβαλί και ευμασέλο χαλικωμένων. So it's the original text. They retained the text and the language and made their own designs using a mixture of photo montage and pencils. Actually, their drawings, you can see them again here, were edited in an open source photo editor similar to Photoshop, and the final product in aesthetic terms is at least interesting. The other group, the Sachlikis group, stayed close to the original text and the language as well, but used panels and strips from other very well-known comics, mostly, as you can see, Maurice Lucky Luke, and a Greek comic, Kokalidis Lysistrata, but also from Asterix. This is from Asterix. They mixed up everything. A dangerous choice in my view, but they managed, because you know they take ready-made panels, they take ready-made drawings, and they have to adapt them to a text. But they did it very successfully. They managed to adapt the ready-made pictures to the text in a very successful fashion. The Pikatoros group, on the other hand, provided a very distant adaptation of the original text in contemporary modern Greek and used mixed media. They designed the main character. This is the main character. They, oops, what happened? It's not working? Yeah, this is the main character. They designed him as a priest. And also used many photographs and drawings, not always on high analysis, as you can see. This is Eve and the snake. While the group of Rimada, the rhyme of the maid and the lad, followed closely the original text and produced their own color drawings, also mixing them with snapshots of famous Barbie dolls. You know, this is Ken. This is the pages of the rape scene. You can see the blood here as they imagined it. Equally varied, but following more or less the same patterns, were the solutions that the prose groups gave. Even though some of them would not go beyond the stage of a storyboard, this is the Macheras comic, others would add finer pencils. This is the Alexander comic. And one of them came up with a new idea, that of the use of famous paintings from different periods, styles, and countries that would still fit the faithful to the original text script. It's the group for the eruption of the Santorini volcano. All in all, one could say that these courses offered students a way to express their creativity and help them produce the first digital comics of early modern Greek literary texts ever. And I must say that the Apokopos comic was published last year independently in a Cypriot art and literature magazine, something of course that made us all very proud. But still, the production of these comics was not the most important aspect of my courses. In fact, producing original comics was not even the point of the experiment I conducted at all. In my mind, these courses, in particular the first one, were designed to be an example of transition from traditional literacy to multiliteracies, taking into account multimodality and also the impact of digital technologies and multimedia in the educational process. They can also, and in my view more importantly, be viewed as examples of transition from the traditional way of direct learning in the most efficient way of indirect learning, using the trick of head fake. Head fake is a term borrowed from sports. Or as the late Randy Pausch would describe it, I quote, "The best way to teach somebody something is to have them think they are learning something else." End of quote. I will not bore you with jargon. I just want you to think for a moment how many skills these students acquired and how many goals they achieved in order to produce these comics. First, they read and comprehended texts written in older and often dialectal Greek of the 14th, 15th, 16th to the 19th century. In order to accomplish this, they had to use specialized dictionaries, and especially the 18-volume Kriaras Dictionary of Medieval Greek Vernacular, and built their own vocabularies, often in their own wikis. This is the wiki of the Apokopos group. So they were doing this themselves. They set up the wikis themselves, and they were discussing the meaning of words, doing their proper research in dictionaries. For a better understanding of the texts in question, they had to take into account the socio-historical conditions in which these texts were produced and the genres to which they belonged. This required critical reading and understanding of secondary bibliography, and I was informed by the university library staff that for a month they had my students turning the library upside down to find all the material they could for their text, something that is rarely done willingly and happily by undergraduate students. In order to come up with a script for the visualization of each text, they had to understand its structure and proceed to its deconstruction and reconstruction to provide adequate narration and dialogues. The latter, in particular, sometimes required interventions like composing metrically and linguistically appropriate verses for those who decided to remain faithful to the original verse from the text. All groups conquered necessarily some kind of digital and information literacy. And I mean, besides the use of the Comic Lab software, all teams had to look up for bibliography and images in specialized databases and or on the internet. They had to scan and convert images into specific formats, edit digital images with the use of some editor like Photoshop, and integrate these images into panels. The latter, of course, presupposed that they had previously understood what panels are, what dialogue and narration clouds are, the many different ways in which one can set up text and images in a comic page. In a nutshell, they had to understand what comics are. But beyond the cognitive part of all this, all teams also acquired some kind of social literacy, which is of course equally important and came as a result of the teamwork they had to do. The division of roles and tasks, the interaction between team members, the process of learning from one's own mistakes and the questions of others, the usefulness of collaboration, but also the bitter necessity of sidelining one's ego in order to achieve a common goal within a specific framework, all functioned very well, and of course highlighted the problems that always occur in collaborative enterprises. Some students would take the lead and do the job for the whole team, while others withdrew silently and waited for their fellow students to do the work for them. In many groups there were disagreements about the choices they had to make, quite naturally of course, because these groups were composed by different people who did not have many things in common beyond their random coexistence in a group that nevertheless had a very clear common target. But in all groups, when deadlines were approaching, All members set aside differences and work hard together in order to complete their projects on time, and I must say that I'm proud for the timely submission of all projects. Now, if you think of all these achievements of goals, doesn't the fact that they actually produced the first comic books, literary comic books, sound less significant? To conclude, I have presented an experiment that was that has hopefully demonstrated how comics can be used in the classroom for the achievement of learning objectives and for the development or enhancement of linguistic, textual, visual, digital, and social literacy, while also allowing space for the expression of students' creativity. The choice of my subject today was based on my firm belief that the future of education lies in creativity, technology, and multiliteracies. Helping our students develop their skills through creative processes that allow them to express themselves, to acquire knowledge, and learn how to learn is what matters the most, in my view. Of course, this requires a paradigm shift in education, a shift from traditional knowledge packages to more imaginative and effective ways of learning, and also requires extra work on both the students' and the educator's part. But my experience tells me that this can be done both pleasantly and successfully. Thank you for your attention.
How do you, as a teacher, feel about changing the sense of the text?
Changing the sense?
Yes. You said that one of the comics changed,
so it was just, thank you for the question, it was a free adaptation and it had a lot of modern elements. It was fine with me. I didn't impose this restriction to them. They could do whatever they wanted with the text. So the team felt that they could retain the main plot but then change the language. It was fine. I did. You see, they were not supposed to be, they were adaptations anyhow. So it didn't matter. The other three teams, they didn't change the language, which was also fine. But I didn't mind. I don't know if it answers your question. I didn't mind, basically. You think I should? Thank you.
You said that you're interested also in literary theory, so I was wondering, have you considered an opportunity of letting students create a comic not only on fictional text, but maybe on some inventing, functioning, transformation of literary devices during the, literary process? And maybe imagining some plots based on their functioning, and maybe it will be useful also.
They were allowed to do whatever they wanted with the text. They could adapt the script any way they wanted. They could change it in any way, in any manner they wanted. So, yes, it could be done, if that's what you're asking.
Maybe
you want.
So if you have to take a course on literary theory, not
yes.
just on literary history, on history of literature, you should face some issues, some terms that are not really clear.
Right. You know, there is a series of comic books published already that deals with theoretical movements. Yes. Like, for instance, you can have postmodernism for beginners, or you can have Karl Marx for beginners, or and in fact they are very useful. Yes, they can be used. But my idea was not to use ready-made comic books in the classroom, because this has been done, and it is done from even now. When comics appeared in the States in the 1930s, the first thing, of course, there were reactions against them. So the first thing educators did was to say, look, they are useful. We can bring them in the class and help students, for instance, instead of asking them to read Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey, they can read the comic adaptation. And they have been doing this for about 80 years now in classrooms. What I wanted to do was to get them involved in the creation.
But why not let them an opportunity to create
Their own?
comics?
Yes, because that would have been even more difficult, I think. You need to have more experienced students. If I could have the same group of 44 people working with me again, I could ask them to do whatever they want. They have been doing what you're saying, their own scenarios, based on their own experiences, in primary and secondary schools in Greece and Spain. That was the purpose of the EduComics project.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. I don't know if I answered your question. Okay.